Welcome, Patrick, to Tower Bridge. And I think it's about half a year ago that we first met and you presented us with an amazing collection. Before we get into that, can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
I'm actually Patrick Cruttwell Molineux, and my great-grandfather was Edward Cruttwell, who was the resident engineer on Tower Bridge, which meant he was in charge of the building of it right from the start, right through to the end. And indeed, after he'd finished the building of it, he remained as the resident engineer for 3 years, the first 3 years when the bridge was in operation. And then for the rest of his life, until 1933, he was the consulting engineer on the bridge. So he had a 45-year connection with the bridge.
And I remember when you first showed them to me in a cafe around the corner, you pulled out this envelope full of photographs and you said something like, you've probably seen them before and they're nothing special and there's so many of those. But I opened the envelope and I have to admit I got goosebumps because as a historian and a person interested in the history of Tower Bridge, they were absolutely unique. They were unseen, unpublished before, and a real discovery and a treasure.
Our mother had always told us that our great-grandfather was in charge of the building of Tower Bridge, but mothers tell stories, and we never quite knew whether that was true or not. She died 2 years ago, and before she died, she showed me, because I'm kind of the family historian, having done a history degree, 2 enormous red archive boxes, this big, full of papers. In these 2 big archive boxes, there was a little envelope. It was quite small, and it just had the initials EC on it, obviously for Edward Cruttwell, and there were a series of photographs. And they were snapshots. They were candid photographs of what looked like the opening of Tower Bridge. And I said to her, aren't these important? And she said, oh, I didn't think so, just sort of standard things. So I kind of put it to one side. And when she died, part of my grieving process for her was to write my family history, or our family history. And the more I went through that, the more I found about Edward Cruttwell, and I thought, oh blimey, actually, John Wolfbarry did place him in charge of the building of Tower Bridge, and so all of this material I had available.
So Patrick, what made you decide to reach out to Tower Bridge with your collection?
I discussed what I'd found with my sisters, Petra and Lucy, and my brother Bill, and I mean, we immediately thought we should give Tower Bridge the letters and the photos and whatever you wanted, because from our point of view, these were important documents, for Tower Bridge for London. They shouldn't sit in a box in my study. They should be shared more widely. And in a way, that was celebrating our family history. That was celebrating Edward Cruttwell's life. It feels the best possible tribute to Edward Cruttwell, whose name isn't that well known, but through this exhibition we can celebrate his life and his achievements and his contribution to London and his contribution to the engineering profession, and indeed maybe celebrate Britain's engineers. He lived at a time when Britain produced the greatest engineers in the world. To have that family connection is extraordinary. It's transformed, I suppose, our sense of as a family of how we feel about our ancestors.
We know Edward Cruttwell, of course, here at Tower Bridge as the resident engineer, but there was clearly much more to him. He was a private man from an important family. Tell us a little bit about his background.
He came from a well-to-do family in Frome in Somerset. His father, Wilson Clement Cruttwell, was a solicitor. He knew tragedy. He was the 10th of 11 children. 5 of his siblings died young. He was educated at Clifton College near Bristol, and then went to King's College to study engineering, as Henry Mark Brunel did. He joined R.P. Brereton as an articled pupil of Brereton's, working on Neath Harbour works, and after a couple of years, with Brereton, left to join the partnership of Barry and Brunel.
So we know about Cruttwell, the engineer, his professional life. What was he as a private man? What was his convictions, his political views?
We know a surprising amount about him from his papers. At a time in the early 1900s when this wasn't common, he had 3 votes because he was a wealthy man and he had 3 houses, and he placed them at the disposal of the suffragette movement because he believed in votes for women. He worked very closely and then sponsored for the Institution of Civil Engineers, an Indian engineer.
Yeah, there was Keshav Chijamchibupati, who's also present here in our exhibition.
Indeed, yes, and I think it's great that he was working so closely with an Indian engineer at a time when perhaps, many people from a white male privileged background maybe wouldn't have done. He loved the finer things in life. He had an account at Harrods that seemed to get a lot of attention. He developed quite a property portfolio. He had a large townhouse in London. He had a country estate, a Bayfield in Leatherhead and Surrey, and his holiday home was a property called Sandy Point on Hayling Island. He owned 62 acres of Hayling Island.
Okay, tell me more about his family life, his wife, his children.
Well, he married Gwynedd Erskine here, in this photo of her with one of her beloved dogs. She was the sister of one of his best friends, George Erskine, who he had met when articled to R.P. Brereton, and they were working together on the Neath Harbour works. Edward and Gwynedd had 3 sons. They had Clement Henry, Patrick Erskine, my grandfather, and Colin Edward. The eldest, Clement, became a civil engineer, followed his father. Patrick Erskine, my grandfather, actually became an accountant and was one of the early employees of the BBC, working for Lord Reith. And Colin Edward became an electrical engineer, so a different side of the engineering profession.
After his studies and his time at Brereton's office, what was his journey to Tower Bridge?
In 1879, he joined the very new at the time partnership of Barry and Brunel, who I think had formed a partnership in 1878. And he spent some time doing office work for them. But then in 1883, they appointed him resident engineer in charge of the construction of Blackfriars Railway Bridge just over there. He obviously did well because in 1885, I have a letter from his father, Wilson Clement Cruttwell, giving Edward advice about whether Edward would take one of 2 positions John Wolfe Barry had offered him. One was as permanent assistant to John Wolfe Barry, a head office job, and the other was resident engineer of Tower Bridge. And Edward's father says in the letter, "I know you thought that Tower Bridge was the thing. I think Tower Bridge is the thing." And clearly Edward made that decision to take the Tower Bridge position.
So we have to thank his father as well as his own decision. What did a resident engineer do? What was his responsibilities?
As resident engineer, he was placed in charge of the building. In fact, Barry and Brunel stated that he was in sole charge of the construction of Tower Bridge. He was responsible for leading a team that averaged 432 people over the course of the 8 years of construction, a team of more than 1,200 in total. He was responsible for managing the contractors and ensuring that the build was done to schedule and to quality and to cost. He really was the man who pulled on the waders. Barry, of course, rightly got the plaudits and was the man in the spotlight at the official opening, but it was Cruttwell who, in the after party for the 1,200 workers at Tower Bridge, was the chair of that. So we see in some of the letters, this one, from Henry Mark Brunel, Isambard Kingdom Brunel's son, talks about how Edward was placed in charge of the construction because of the confidence that Barry and Brunel had in him. This is a typical letter from Brunel, actually giving Edward a pay rise to £375 a year in 1890, midway through the construction. So we have a lovely archive showing Edward's role through Tower Bridge.
How old was he when he started work at Tower Bridge?
The thing I am in most awe about is that he was 28. His father had just died, and John Wolfe Barry, one of the foremost engineers in the world, said to him, "Here's the Tower Bridge Act, here are the plans, you're in charge of what was the most significant engineering project of its time in this country. The largest opening bridge, bascule bridge, that had ever been built, the most expensive bridge that had been built." And they placed a 28-year-old in charge of its construction, which I think was quite a vote of confidence.
So Cruttwell was, I think, 36 when he finished working at Tower Bridge and he had completed the job. What was his professional life afterwards? Must have been a stepping stone for a glorious career.
It did. It certainly made Barry's name, and Barry got his knighthood, but it also made Cruttwell's name. He was appointed actually by Bridge House Estates, now the City Bridge Foundation, as the consulting engineer for all of their bridges. So he looked after Tower Bridge and London Bridge and Blackfriars Bridge and Southwark Bridge, and became something of an expert on London bridges. He bid and was awarded first prize in the competition for Sydney Harbour Bridge, although his design did not go forward, and so he cannot claim the credit for that, because it was a different designer 2 decades later that actually had the design. The previous London Bridge over there, not the modern one, but the previous one, he was responsible for the widening of that as chief engineer. During the First World War, he worked for the Ministry of Explosive Supply. When Barry died, he became the senior partner in Sir John Wolfe Barry and Partners. He was engineer to the Imperial War Graves Commission. So he became a reasonably substantial figure in the engineering profession.
That begs the question somehow, why is his name not wider known to the public?
It's an interesting question why he's not better known. I think first in this country we perhaps don't celebrate the engineers that we have had. How many people could name many engineers? Perhaps in Isambard Kingdom Brunel, maybe Sir John Wolfe Barry, but most people couldn't name many more, despite the huge engineering success that we had in this country. Secondly, Edward was very closely associated with Sir John Wolfe Barry, who was known as one of the greatest engineers in the world. And I think perhaps if you stand in the shadow of such greatness, it's harder for the spotlight to find you. Thirdly, I think the truly great engineers, the ones who get their knighthood, the ones whose name are so well known, have a great project, a global project, where they are the chief engineer. For Sir John Wolfe Barry, that was here, Tower Bridge. Edward was a famous bridge designer that's recognised in press reports of many newspapers at the time, but he never had a single great project under his belt. And so I think perhaps maybe one of the disappointments for him, and my mother told me before she died that it was something of a disappointment, he never got his knighthood. He never had that final great project.
And that's why it's so beautiful that we can celebrate the man in his achievements with his exhibition and the photographs you've brought to us. Shall we have a look at them?
One of the most interesting, I think, and we discussed this when we met, was these ones of the steamroller. I think you told me that you had from the archives documents that said that the way they strength tested the bridge before it opened was rolling steamrollers backwards and forwards. And some of these photos, several of them, show these huge steamrollers pulling these enormous trailers filled with stone and rock to test that the bridge could cope. One wonders what would have happened if it didn't cope, but it clearly did.
Interesting also that we can actually date these photographs, because we have reports that these tests took place on the 21st of June, 1894, which is just over a week before the official opening.
I think probably the most interesting or exciting photos, the one most relevant to London are these crowd scenes of Londoners from the public opening. The royal opening is fine with all the great dignitaries in their finery, but these photos show how Londoners embraced the bridge right from the very beginning.
The interesting thing is, it was a Monday. It was Monday the 9th of July, 1894, and 140,000 people turned up on that day. So the bridge was already, when it first launched, welcomed by Londoners and appreciated for its style and for its function, and a big success right from the start.
It was an icon from its birth. The ones I particularly like are the ones where Edward shows. I think that's Edward there, and here's Edward talking, I think, to John Wilkes Barre on the bridge, and there are workers behind him. There's two workers there carrying a steel girder while Cruttwell and Barre are talking. There's a workman here standing over the join in the bridge, doing something. The beauty of these photos is that they are candid photos. They're not posed royal photos. They're people doing their jobs.
And that's the unique thing, I think, about this collection as well. There are, as well as wonderful documents of a moment in the history of London, which we show in the exhibition, but also a starting point for further research and for further connections from Tower Bridge and beyond. Well, we can look forward to an exciting summer on the bridge, and that's thanks to you and your family's donation to Tower Bridge. And I hope all the visitors from London and from all over the world will appreciate that.
You're very welcome.